Today we're going to talk about leadership theories, and there are fundamentally two approaches that evolved over time. One is referred to as a trait approach, trait theories, the other as behavioral theories. Trait theories, the goal of trait theorists is to um, distill a limited number of leaders' characteristics that are associated with effective leadership and that predicts effective leadership in the future. So, for example, we might say, I don't know, that intelligent people tend to be effective leaders, and that actually is partially true. Now, on the other hand, behavioral theorists look at how leaders act and attempt um, to define certain behaviors that are associated with effective leadership and can be used as predictors of effective leadership in the future. So let's start by looking at trait theories. And within that domain, three major characteristics have been distilled, developed. And I should probably not even call them characteristics because they are more of a broad definitions, broader concepts. The first one is intelligence. Number two, personality, and number three, physical characteristics. So we looked into those three domains, trying to identify uh, what what accounts for an effective leader. And frankly speaking, the only characteristics that have been found consistent with or among all effective leaders is intelligence. And even that I should qualify, because what was really important was the above average intelligence. Now, why people below that standard do not account for good leaders is probably obvious. Uh, Whereas why people that are extremely intelligent, so above that standard of above average intelligence, do not account for effective leaders is perhaps less so. Um, and it's less obvious because fundamentally people with that sort of intelligence, or let's call them geniuses, uh, cannot communicate effectively due to the fact that, and here's an operational word for us, they cannot relate to file and rank workers, and vice versa. File and rank workers cannot uh, relate to leaders with that sort of brain power, so to speak. When we talk about the intelligence, we should probably also make that distinction between IQ and EQ, right? The intelligence based on this more traditional logic, logical reasoning, IQ, and EQ, the emotional quotient, the intelligence based on the ability to relate to other people and communicate with ease. In fact, the research shows that when it comes to success, in organization, EQ outweighs IQ 3 to 1. So um, uh, one way to one way um, to exemplify it in the organization would be by looking at managers who are always trying to look cool, always uh, always look stress-free when working under pressure. And that is an example actually of poor EQ communication, because we all experience stress and anxiety when faced with difficult tasks. And our constant attempt to hide it actually leads to a poor leadership abilities. And the research found that those kind of managers who always try to hide those kind of emotions have been found much less effective uh, than managers who appear more human to employees. In fact, here is a quote I really like about logic and emotions. I don't know who said that, but I really like it. And here we go. Logic may convince people to your ideas, that's the IQ, but only emotions motivate, that's the EQ. Uh, Now, when it comes to the other two traits, that is personality and physical characteristics, now we haven't really been that successful in terms of distilling something that could be consistently associated with effective leadership. Uh, when it comes to personality, we usually think about the distinction between introverts and extroverts, and it's not true, as some might think, that extroverts are always better than introverts. There is place for introverts as well, and in fact, the world is full of very effective introverts, very effective as leaders. Example of that could be it could be IBM's CEO Bill Gates, who in some biographies I recall being referred to as a social misfit. And yet today he's leading very effectively uh, 15th, 16th economy of the world, depending on the day. Uh, eh, eh, and finally, physical characteristics have also not been associated with effective leadership one way or another. In other words, effective leaders come in various sizes. They don't have to look like Arnold Schwarzenegger. Right? Um, uh, we can even look at historical figures such as Napoleon Bonaparte, Hitler, and many others. When it comes to behavioral theories, there are three major approaches that evolved, and they have to do with the amount of empowerment that the managers allow to the employees, and the way they communicate with the employees. That's why the behaviors, they have to do with how managers act. Um, and the first one is referred to as autocratic style of leadership, and it implies the least amount of empowerment, and the style of communication referred to as telling. So it's a one-way communication, and technically zero empowerment on the part of employees. Democratic style of leadership is associated with communication styles referred to as consulting and selling, and is associated with moderate amount of empowerment. And finally, laissez-faire, the style of leadership representing most empowerment, uh, and fundamentally it comes from French let it go, sometimes referred in translation as a leaderless style of leadership, simply because there is no there is practically no imposing of any structure on employees. They pretty much make their own decisions. So when it comes to those three approaches um, to leadership, autocratic, democratic, and laissez-faire, um, we might say they are all situational. All behavioral approaches have been found to be situational. They are all good in under certain circumstances. So fundamentally, what we need to understand is what kind of circumstances are associated with what kind of style of leadership. So autocratic leadership, for example, has been found most useful when it comes to managing blue-collar workers. Um, and that implies simple, repetitive jobs, a stable environment. That implies small groups, excuse me, large groups, because in those circumstances there is one person who needs to take charge and make a decision. So large groups, relatively poorly developed relationships with employees would warrant autocratic style of leadership. So for instance, during the early phases of new employee onboarding, or during the training situations, especially where expensive equipment might be involved, then autocratic style of leadership might be most appropriate. Democratic style of leadership, so this is somewhere in between the extremes, usually associated with white collar workers, medium complexity of a job, uh, relatively volatile environment, changing environment, uh, relatively well-developed relationship with employees, since some sort of an empowerment is going to take place. We need to have we need to know employees in terms of the abilities and their motivation, and of course relatively small groups in this case, because we're talking about creativity, innovation. And finally, laissez-faire style of leadership, this most empowered behavior on the part of leader could be justified when it comes to professionals, um, doctors, engineers, etc. In those cases, those jobs represent a very specialized type of environment, very volatile type of environment, where innovation and creativity are key. Of course, relationship has to be very well developed between manager and employees to justify that level of empowerment. Now let me read additional research findings on autocratic, democratic, and laissez-faire style of leadership. Autocratic leadership has been found to increase productivity, produces more accurate solutions when leader is knowledgeable, more positively accepted in larger groups, enhances performance on simple tasks, decreases performance on complex tasks, increases aggression levels among employees, increases turnover rates among employees. Democratic leadership lowers turnover and absenteeism rates, increases follower satisfaction, increases follower participation, increases follower commitment to decisions, increases innovation and creativity. And finally, laissez-faire style of leadership has been found to decrease innovation in most cases, decrease follower motivation and satisfaction, decrease quality and quantity of output. The only case in which laissez-faire style of leadership has been found effective is increase productivity and satisfaction for highly motivated experts. In all other situations, laissez-faire style of leadership has been found ineffective. Only when it comes to work with highly motivated and developed experts such as medical researchers, NASA workers, the total empowerment, leader basically leaving the room and leaving employees to their own devices. That's the only situational circumstance in which laissez-faire style of leadership has been found effective. Now, when it comes to three leadership styles and associated communication styles, there are of course also certain situational circumstances warranting the use of one style of communication over another. So again, I'm gonna read a list for each. So for instance, when it comes to autocratic style of leadership, the style of communication associated with it is telling. So one-way communication, as we remember, when we just autocratically tell employees what to do. And this style of leadership communication is most warranted in training situations where basic skills are to be taught, safety issues are involved, and integrity of valuable equipment, materials, supplies are involved. Selling is associated with democratic style of leadership. Is most useful in mediation situation to implement policy or instructions from higher organizational levels. It's especially useful when commitment on the part of employees is needed. Group goals are at variance with those of a leader and organization, and they have to be convinced to the idea. Consulting is one step higher from selling, is also associated with democratic style of leadership, and is justified when the problem is large and complex enough to require attention of the entire group. Also, the group must have necessary knowledge and experience to address the problem, and leader must have high level of confidence with the group. Remember, that has to do with a well-developed relationship with employees. And finally, joining style of communications is associated with a laissez-faire style of leadership, or remember calling leaderless style of leadership. That's why we join basically the decisions made by the employees, no question asked. This style of leadership is most useful when the decision is more meaningful to the group than to the manager or the organization. Also, group must be mature and willing to assume the responsibility. A group must have necessary knowledge and experience to address the problem, and leader must have high level of confidence with the group. So again, as we see, the higher we go, the more confidence and the better developed relationship we must have with the employees.